He was a veteran Navy SEAL who thought his hardest missions were already behind him. His dog had saved lives before, but this time it stopped him in the middle of a quiet forest. Buried beneath mud and trees was something no map wanted remembered. A ship, a warning, and a past that refused to stay silent. What they uncovered would force one man to face the moment he arrived too late and choose differently this time. Some instincts don't come from training. They come from something higher, guiding us when we least expect it. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, like and subscribe to K9 Navy SEAL Stories. Early summer in the northern United States had a particular kind of brightness, clear, cool, almost holy. Sunlight slipped between tall pine trunks and fell in long, pale ribbons across the forest floor. Somewhere beyond the trees, a lake lay flat as a sheet of glass, reflecting sky so perfectly it looked like the world had been folded in half and stitched together by light. Ethan Cole moved through that brightness like a man still learning how to belong in it. He was 43, 6'1", broad-shouldered in a way that didn't come from vanity, but from years of being shaped by training and necessity. His body carried the compact strength of someone who had once lived in short bursts of violence and long stretches of waiting. His face was angular, jaw set, as if it had spent decades refusing to tremble. A rough shadow of beard, more habit than style, darkened his cheeks and chin. His eyes were the striking kind people remembered later. Blue-gray, deep, watchful, as if the world kept trying to surprise him and failing. His hair was cut short in a practical military style, dark brown with faint streaks of early silver at the temples. He looked like someone who didn't waste time on mirrors, someone who measured life in decisions, not appearances. Today's mission, if it could be called that, was simple. Trail safety inspection after the spring thaw. It was the kind of job people described as peaceful. Ethan had learned that peaceful didn't always mean easy. Sometimes peace was just quiet enough for memories to get loud. He wore a single outfit the way some men wore armor, an olive field jacket that had seen weather and didn't complain about it, dark blue cargo pants, and a red and deep green plaid shirt underneath, an odd, warm flash of color against the cool forest tones. His brown leather boots were scuffed and softened by miles. A battered military watch sat on his wrist. A folding pocket knife rode in his jacket. And on his back was an Eberly stock half-track pack, tactical, tough, and slightly absurd for a man whose biggest threat today was a twisted ankle. Beside him padded Ranger. Ranger was a German shepherd, a retired K9 who moved like he still had a job to do. He was all controlled power, balanced shoulders, lean muscle, quick reflexes. His coat was short and dense, black along the saddle of his back, golden tan on his legs and chest. The fur looked like it had been designed for bad weather and worse nights. His ears stood alert, swiveling toward distant sounds, and his eyes were dark and intelligent, the kind that didn't just see things, they evaluated them. Ranger was disciplined in a way Ethan respected. Not obedient in the simple sense. Ranger didn't follow because he was told to. Ranger followed because he chose to. And when he stopped, it meant something. They reached a junction where the maintained trail met a rougher service path. A wooden sign warned hikers to stay within designated areas. Beneath it, another posted notice was newer, bright orange, stapled over old wood. Closed. Ground instability. No entry. Ethan slowed. He didn't like signs that looked like they'd been put up after someone had already learned the lesson the hard way. Ranger stopped too, not a casual pause. A full stop, head lowered slightly, ears forward, chest still. The dog's posture tightened as if the forest had whispered a code word. Ethan exhaled through his nose. "What is it, buddy?" Ranger didn't glance at him. His attention was fixed on the edge of the restricted area where the ground dipped into a shallow hollow, cluttered with fallen branches and damp leaves. He sniffed once, slow and deliberate, and then pulled gently at the leash, just enough to ask. Ethan's humor, when it appeared, tended to arrive bone dry. "You know," he murmured, We're retired. We're supposed to be afraid of paperwork, not the woods." Ranger gave him nothing but that hard, focused stare into the trees. Ethan hesitated. His instincts were a strange mix now, half the cautious procedure of his new job, half the old SEAL reflex that always wanted to confirm the unknown. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and marked a GPS point at the sign. Then he took a photo of the orange notice and the hollow beyond it. He lifted his shoulder mic. "Trail Ops, this is Cole. I'm at the North Section Junction near the closure sign. I've got something off trail, requesting details on the restricted zone." The radio crackled. A man's voice came through, calm and clipped, the sound of someone who'd repeated the same warnings for years. "Copy, Cole. Restricted zone is active. Ground shift area, sinkhole risk, do not enter. Log it and move on." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "Any recent incidents?" A pause. Not long, but long enough to feel like someone checking which truth was allowed. "Negative on recent, but the area's unstable. We don't want anyone getting hurt." Ethan looked at Ranger. The dog's body remained taut, nose angled toward the hollow like a compass needle that refused to be ignored. "Understood," Ethan said into the mic. He clipped it off. For a moment, he stood there, listening. Birdsong threaded through the pines. Wind moved through the branches with a soft shushing sound, like an old lullaby. The lake in the distance threw bright flashes of reflected sun. Everything looked harmless. And yet Ethan felt it, the faint pressure behind his ribs, the sensation of an invisible hand resting on his sternum. The old feeling, the one that said, "This is the moment. Choose wisely." He spoke quietly, as if the forest itself might overhear. 50 yards, he told Ranger. "We confirm what you're smelling, and then we're out. Deal?" Ranger's tail stayed low, steady. No excitement, no fear, just purpose. They stepped off the maintained trail. The ground softened almost immediately, spongy, with damp leaf litter. Ethan placed his boots carefully, eyes scanning for obvious hazards. Ranger moved ahead by a few feet, leash slack but never loose, guiding with subtle confidence. Then Ethan noticed something strange. Ranger wasn't tracking the way dogs usually did. He wasn't zigzagging or letting his nose sweep wildly. He was moving in a straight, thoughtful line, occasionally pausing to sample the air like a professional tasting something rare. Ethan's mind snagged on a memory. Salt spray on his lips, the smell of old rope, and the sharp tar scent of ship maintenance. A smell from another world. He frowned. Why would a forest smell like a dock? Ranger stopped near a patch of moss and decaying leaves. He pawed lightly at the ground, careful, controlled, no frantic digging. Just enough to peel back the wet layer like turning a page. Something dark and smooth appeared beneath the leaves. A piece of wood, carved, weathered, and strangely out of place. Ethan crouched and brushed it clean with his gloved hand. The wood held an old, stubborn scent, hardened pitch, faint brine, the ghost of water that didn't belong this far inland. Ethan's stomach tightened. He lifted the piece, turning it over. Along one edge, faint etched lines formed a pattern, curves and flourishes that resembled waves, or perhaps the scrollwork of a ship's ornamentation. Ranger stared at it without blinking. Ethan swallowed. "This isn't from around here." And that's when the forest did something that made his skin go cold. Not a sound exactly, more like the memory of a sound. A single soft metallic tink drifted through the air, as if something small had tapped a bell far away. Ethan froze, holding his breath to listen harder. The birds continued singing. Wind continued moving. Nothing else changed. Ranger's head snapped up. His ears angled toward the hollow, and his body went rigid, as if someone had called his name in a language only he understood. Ethan's pulse quickened. He'd heard imagined noises before. PTSD had a cruel talent for that. But this felt different. This didn't feel like a gunshot echo or a flashback trick. This felt like an invitation. Ranger stepped forward again, tugging the leash with quiet insistence. Ethan rose slowly. His mind argued with itself in clean, logical sentences. The sign says closed. The radio says don't enter. The ground can collapse. This job is supposed to keep people safe. And then another voice, older, rougher, whispered through him. If you turn away from the wrong thing, you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you chose comfort over truth. He tightened his grip on the leash. All right, he said softly, not entirely sure who he was speaking to. We look, we don't stay. They moved deeper, and the hollow widened into a shallow valley where the trees leaned at odd angles, their roots half exposed. The air felt cooler here, heavier. Ethan's phone, GPS, blinked, uncertainly, as if embarrassed to admit it didn't know where they were. A fallen tangle of branches blocked part of the view. Ranger navigated around it, then stopped at the edge of a slope. Ethan stepped beside him. And there it was. At first, Ethan's brain refused to label it. It looked like a curve of ancient bone or the ribbed spine of something mythic that had died and been half buried by time. Then his eyes found the shape, the line, the unmistakable geometry. A bow, a ship's bow, wooden, massive, and scarred by age. The timbers were dark, split in places, slick with moisture and old rot. Rusted metal hugged the structure like remnants of armor. It sat in the sinking valley as if the earth had tried to swallow it and failed, like a giant creature caught mid-breath. A ship in the forest. Ethan's mouth went dry. Ranger lowered his head, not in fear, but in a controlled, trained posture Ethan recognized. The stance of a working dog encountering an unknown threat. Readiness that was also respect. Ethan stared, unable to move for several seconds. Something inside him shifted, something long, locked up. He felt the sharp edge of the past press against the present, not like a weapon, but like a key turning in an old door. He didn't know why this thing existed here. He didn't know who had put it here or how long it had been waiting. But he felt it, clear as a hand on his shoulder. This wasn't simply a discovery. This was a summons. And if he walked away now, the forest would remain bright and beautiful and indifferent, while something important stayed buried, patient, until it found someone else. Ethan's voice came out quieter than he intended. You didn't lead me wrong, he whispered to Ranger. Ranger didn't look up. He kept his gaze fixed on the ship, as if guarding a doorway only he understood. And in the bright northern sunlight, with the lake glittering somewhere beyond the pines, Ethan Cole felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not peace, not certainty, but the unmistakable beginning of purpose. Ethan didn't walk out of the hollow like a man who'd just found something impossible. He walked out like a man who'd found something inevitable. The forest looked the same on the way back, sunlight on needles, the lake flashing through gaps in the trees, the birds gossiping like they always had. But Ethan felt as though he'd crossed an invisible boundary, and the air behind him had sealed shut. Ranger stayed close to his left leg, moving with that quiet, professional focus that made Ethan forget, sometimes, that the dog was officially retired. His black and tan coat caught the light in sharp lines, and his eyes kept flicking toward the valley as if he expected it to follow. Ethan returned to the closure sign and stopped there long enough to do the boring parts that kept people alive. He logged the GPS coordinates, attached the photos, and added a note that the terrain appeared more unstable than the posted warning implied. He keyed his radio again. Cole to trail. Ops, I'm back at the closure sign. I've documented the area, requesting that someone, qualified, assess the integrity of the ground near the boundary. Static, then the dispatcher's voice. Copy. Supervisor will be notified. Ethan waited for the follow-up question. What did you see? How bad is it? But none came. The silence on the line felt like a door closing gently. "Understood," he said, and clipped the mic back. When he turned toward the main trail, Ranger didn't move. The dog stood fixed, ears up, body angled toward the restricted zone. His tail was low and steady, not tucked, not aggressive, just anchored. Ethan sighed. "I know," he murmured, "but we're not doing hero stuff today." Ranger's gaze didn't soften. If anything, it sharpened, like a soldier refusing to accept a retreat as the final plan. A set of footsteps approached on the gravel path. Ethan looked up and saw a woman walking toward him with the decisive pace of someone who had spent years managing other people's mistakes. She was in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, tall and wiry, with a posture that suggested she'd learned to stand firm against weather and stubborn hikers alike. Her hair was a sandy blonde pulled into a practical braid under a Forest Service cap. Freckles dusted her fair skin. Her eyes, hazel, alert, held the guarded patience of a person who knew the woods could be both beautiful and cruel. She wore the uniform of the local trail authority. Green shirt, utility belt, radio clipped high on her chest. The name tag read, Nora Hale. "Ethan Cole?" she called, as if confirming a detail in her head. "That's me." Nora's gaze dropped to Ranger. The dog did not bark, did not wag. He simply watched her with calm appraisal. "That's your K9, Nora said, not quite a question. "Was," Ethan corrected. Then softer. "He still thinks it's his job." Nora's mouth tightened in a line that could have been a smile if it trusted the world more. Sometimes they're right. She stopped near the closure sign and glanced at the orange notice. The expression on her face shifted, subtle, but Ethan caught it. Not surprise, more like resignation. "I got the message from Trail Ops," Nora said. "They told me you flagged something near the boundary." Ethan nodded. "The ground is worse than the sign suggests." Nora studied him a moment, as if measuring how much truth he could handle. "Let's walk." They moved a few steps to where the forest opened just enough to overlook the start of the hollow. Nora kept a careful distance from the slope, toes angled away from the soft edge. She'd done this before, Ethan realized, more times than she wished. "This isn't just a sinkhole," she said. "It's a cold bog valley. Water table sits high. Ground shifts seasonally. Spring thaw makes it hungry." "You agree?" Ethan repeated. Nora nodded once. "That's what the locals call it, because it takes things." Ethan watched her face as she spoke. She didn't say people. She didn't have to. Ranger's ears flicked, his nose lifted and sampled the air, then lowered again, a restless rhythm that felt like the dog arguing with reality. Ethan cleared his throat. "Is that why you posted the closure?" Nora's gaze remained on the hollow. "Yes, and because the county doesn't want another lawsuit." Her voice was blunt, but there was something underneath it. An old fatigue, a bruise that didn't show until you pressed the right spot. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Another." Nora's eyes shifted to his. "You weren't here then." Before Ethan could ask what she meant, a vehicle rolled up on the trailhead access road. Tires crunched over gravel. An unmarked SUV stopped, and the driver's door opened with a sharp, purposeful swing. A woman stepped out with the controlled economy of motion Ethan recognized immediately. Someone who carried authority like a holster. She was medium height, solidly built, with dark hair cut to her jaw and tucked behind her ears. Her skin was olive-toned, her face composed in the way law enforcement often became, expression reduced to what was useful. A faint scar traced the edge of her left eyebrow, thin as a pencil line. Her eyes were brown and direct, the kind that didn't linger on scenery. She wore plain clothes, jeans, a dark jacket, but the badge clipped at her belt flashed when the sun caught it. Her hands were bare and steady. No jewelry except a simple ring. Nora's shoulders tightened slightly. "Deputy Vance." The woman approached, eyes moving from Nora to Ethan to Ranger. When she looked at Ranger, her gaze flickered with a mix of respect and caution, like she'd met working dogs before and learned not to underestimate them. "Ethan Cole," she said. Her voice was firm, low, with that small-town authority that didn't need to shout. "I'm Deputy Marla Vance." Ethan gave a short nod. "Deputy?" Marla stopped near the closure sign and scanned the area like she was already building a mental report. "Trail Ops said you went close to the boundary." "Close," Ethan said evenly. He didn't elaborate. There was a difference between honest and careless. Marla's eyes narrowed a fraction. "And you saw something?" Nora shifted, but didn't speak. Ethan noticed that. Nora wasn't surprised Marla was here. That meant this place had a history with the sheriff's office. Ethan chose his words carefully. "I documented unusual material near the edge. I'm requesting a proper site evaluation." Marla's gaze lingered on him, then dropped to Ranger, who stood like a statue carved from discipline. "Your dog wants in there," Marla observed. "He wants answers," Ethan said. Marla gave a dry sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Don't we all?" She stepped closer to the sign and tapped it with one finger. "This closure isn't optional, not because I like telling grown men what to do, but because the last time someone decided a sign was a suggestion, we spent 3 days in the mud and came back with nothing to show but grief." Ethan held her eyes. "Someone died." The words landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Marla didn't flinch. She nodded once. "Yes." Nora's jaw flexed. She looked away toward the trees, as if the forest had offended her. Ethan felt the old pressure behind his ribs again, the sensation of being seconds away from a decision that would outlive him. Marla kept talking, matter of fact. "Hiker, couple years back, local guy, thought he could shortcut through here, see what the old stories were about. Slipped off the edge. Bog doesn't let go once it has you. We tried. God knows we tried." Ranger's ears pinned back for half a second, then lifted again. His body remained still, but his breathing changed, shorter, sharper. Ethan's hand tightened on the leash. The dog wasn't panicking. He was listening, Marla noticed. "He gets like that when you talk about it?" "Only when something feels familiar," Ethan said. Nora's gaze snapped back. "Familiar how?" Ethan hesitated. If he told them about the ship-shaped structure he'd seen, he risked sounding like a man seeing ghosts in the woods. But he also risked withholding information that could matter. He chose the middle path, truth without embellishment. "There's debris," he said. "Old wood, carving, smells like pitch, like marine sealant." Nora's expression went guarded again. "That's not possible." Marla's eyes didn't widen. Instead, they sharpened, as if she'd just heard a word that fit a puzzle she never admitted she had. "What kind of carving?" she asked. Ethan pictured the curved lines on the wood. Like scrollwork, like it belonged to something built for water. Marla's hand hovered near her radio, not touching it yet. "You kept the piece?" Ethan glanced at his pack. "Yes, bagged." Nora let out a slow breath. "Ethan, this area has stories. People talk, but the woods make fools out of folks who chase legends." Ethan's humor surfaced, thin and tired. "I'm not chasing legends. I'm trying to keep people from dying." Marla's gaze softened a fraction at that. "Then you'll listen when I tell you. You do not go back in there. Not alone. Not with the dog. Not because you've got the skill set or the stubbornness." Ethan nodded once. He meant it. Mostly. Ranger, however, didn't look convinced. His nose lifted again, and his body leaned forward, almost imperceptibly, toward the hollow. Marla watched the dog like she was reading a language she didn't speak fluently but recognized as important. "He's trained," she said. "He is," Ethan replied. "Trained dogs don't get restless without a reason," Marla said. Then, to Nora, We need to double the barriers." Nora frowned. "It's just ground instability. The sign is enough." Marla's mouth tightened. "Wasn't enough last time." The three of them stood in a strange triangle beneath the bright northern sun, each anchored by their own kind of memory. Ethan by war, Nora by years of rescues and paperwork, Marla by the weight of a death she'd had to document in ink, and Ranger by something older than any of them. A sudden gust of wind blew up from the hollow. It wasn't strong, just a breath of air rising from below. But it carried a smell so sharp and specific that Ethan felt it snag behind his eyes. Tar, wet timber, and something faintly metallic, like old coins left in seawater. Ranger reacted instantly. He stopped breathing for a beat, then let out a low sound, not a growl, not a bark. A restrained whine that vibrated with tension. His paws shifted, and for the first time since Ethan had known him, Ranger did something that made Ethan's blood cool. He sat down, perfectly, precisely, then lifted his head toward the hollow and held still, as if waiting for a command that hadn't been given. Marla's gaze snapped to the dog. "What is that?" Ethan swallowed. "That's his alert posture." Nora stared. Alert for what? Ethan didn't answer immediately because the truth was unsettling. Ranger only sat like that when he had found something he believed mattered more than his own safety. Marla stepped closer, her voice low. "Cole, tell me what you're not telling me." Ethan looked down at Ranger. The dog's eyes were fixed on the trees, unblinking, devoted, not afraid, not confused. Devout. Ethan felt the old sense of being watched, by the forest, by the past, by something patient that didn't care about posted signs. He raised his head and met Marla's eyes. "I'm telling you everything I'm sure of," he said quietly. "And there's one thing I'm sure of." "What?" Ethan's voice dropped, almost reverent. "He's not. Wrong." The moment held, taut as wire, until the wind eased and the smell faded. Ranger stood again as if nothing had happened. But Ethan knew something had shifted. Not in the ground. In the story. By late afternoon, Nora had arranged for additional warning tape and planned to schedule a geotechnical assessment. Something official. Something that could be written down. Marla made a call from her SUV, speaking in short phrases that sounded like procedure and caution. Ethan kept his hands busy, repacking the bagged wood, tightening straps, checking the radio battery. Small tasks that kept his mind from spiraling. When Marla returned, her expression was set. "We'll handle this by the book," she said. "Tomorrow, I'll bring someone from the county who knows unstable terrain. Nora will have her crew. You'll be there only if you agree to follow instructions." Ethan nodded. "Understood." Marla's eyes studied him a moment longer, like she was trying to decide whether he was the kind of man who obeyed rules or the kind who obeyed his conscience. "I've met men like you," she said finally. "The ones who think doing the right thing means doing it alone. That's how people die." Ethan's throat tightened. He thought of faces he rarely let himself name. "I'm not trying to be a hero," he said. Marla's gaze flickered, something human showing through the badge. "Good, because heroes make terrible witnesses, and this place already has enough ghosts." Nora returned from the trail junction with fresh tape and a portable barrier panel. She worked quickly, efficiently, no wasted movement, no sentimental pauses. When she was done, she wiped sweat from her forehead and looked at Ethan with tired eyes. "You're new here," she said. "So let me say this plainly. The woods don't care about your past. They don't care about your training. They don't care about your dog's instincts." Ethan almost smiled. Almost. "And you do?" Nora's mouth twitched. "I care about not finding another body." Her honesty hit harder than comfort would have. As they prepared to leave, Ranger paused at the closure sign once more. He didn't pull this time. He simply stood and stared toward the hollow, ears forward, breathing slow. Ethan followed his gaze and felt a shiver of something he didn't have a name for. Not fear, not excitement. Recognition. That night, Ethan returned to the small rental cabin he'd been staying in near the lake, a simple place with pine walls and the faint scent of old smoke. He fed Ranger, checked the dog's paws for cuts, and laid out his gear in neat, unconscious lines the way he always did. When he finally lay down, exhaustion came quickly, but sleep did not bring rest. In the darkness, he dreamed of wood groaning under pressure, of water where no water should be, of a sound that wasn't loud but was impossible to ignore. A bell, somewhere deep in the trees, ringing once, as if counting him. He woke before dawn with his heart hammering. Ranger was already awake, sitting beside the door, eyes fixed on the window as if the forest outside had spoken again. Ethan swallowed the dry fear in his throat and whispered, "Yeah." He didn't know what "yeah" meant yet, but Ranger did. Morning arrived thin and pale, the kind of northern light that looked clean but carried cold underneath it. Ethan Cole drove the county road that skirted the lake, his hand steady on the wheel, his mind less so. He hadn't told Nora or Deputy Vance everything he felt, because feelings weren't evidence, and evidence was the only language that kept people alive. Still, something had shifted since yesterday. The woods had taken a step closer, quiet as a predator. And Ranger, normally content to pace the cabin and settle, had sat by the door before dawn, as if he'd been posted there by an unseen sergeant. Ethan wore the same outfit as always, olive field jacket, dark cargo pants, red and deep green plaid shirt beneath, weathered brown boots. His old military watch ticked steadily against his wrist, the sound small but stubborn. On his back, the Eberly stock half-track pack carried the bagged piece of carved wood like a secret. Ranger rode in the passenger seat with the restraint of a working dog. He didn't press his nose to the window like a pet. He watched the tree line and the lake with narrow-eyed focus, ears flicking at sounds Ethan couldn't place. His black and tan coat gleamed in stripes where the sun hit it. The dog's posture said the same thing it had said yesterday. This matters. Ethan's destination was a small workshop near the lake's western edge, a place the locals called Merriweather's, as if it were a landmark older than the roads. The building looked like it had grown from the shoreline, weathered cedar siding, a slanted roof patched in places, and a porch crowded with stacked lumber. The air around it smelled like sawdust, pine sap, and lake water. An honest mix, uncomplicated, the opposite of Ethan's thoughts. An old man stepped out onto the porch before Ethan even shut off the engine, as though he'd been expecting them. Gus Merriweather was in his late 70s, tall but stooped in the gentle way of someone who'd spent decades bending over wood rather than surrendering to age. His hands were big and scarred, knuckles thickened by work. A gray beard framed his mouth, trimmed short enough to stay out of a workshop, but long enough to show he didn't care about fashion. His hair, white and wiry, stuck out from under a faded ball cap, like it refused to be disciplined. His eyes were what made him memorable, light blue and bright, with a humor that lived behind them like a lamp in a window. But there was also sharpness there, the kind born from years of measuring twice and cutting once. "Well," Gus said as Ethan climbed out, voice rough as sanded oak. "If it isn't the new trailman and his four-legged supervisor." Ethan's mouth twitched. "Morning, Gus." Ranger stepped out and immediately sat, alert but polite. His gaze locked on Gus, not hostile, not friendly, evaluating. Gus looked down at the dog with quiet appreciation. "That's not a house dog." "No," Ethan agreed. "He's retired," Gus snorted. "Ain't no such thing as retired when you've spent your whole life being useful." Ethan felt that sentence land somewhere deep and sore. Inside the workshop, dust motes floated through the sunlight like slow snow. Tools hung in neat rows. Half-finished canoe paddles leaned against one wall, and a long wooden boat hull rested upside down on sawhorses like a sleeping animal. Gus didn't waste time with small talk. He nodded at Ethan's pack. "You brought the mystery." Ethan pulled out the sealed bag and placed it on a workbench. The carved wood inside looked darker in the indoor light, its etched lines more visible. Gus washed his hands at a sink, then put on thin work gloves as if the object might be fragile or sacred. He opened the bag, lifted the wood, and held it close to his face. His eyes narrowed. He didn't just look. He listened with his fingertips, tracing the grain. For a moment, the old man's joking manner vanished. He became something else. Quiet, focused, reverent. Ethan recognized that posture, too. It was the same posture Ranger wore when the world stopped being ordinary. "This isn't trail trash," Gus said finally. Ethan exhaled slowly. "What is it?" Gus turned the piece under the light, studying the carved scrollwork. "This is shipwork, not the kind you buy at a tourist shop. This was made by somebody who knew what they were doing." He sniffed it, then nodded as if confirming a suspicion. "Pitch? Old pitch, not modern sealant. And you see this curve? That's decorative, but functional too, keeps water from sitting where it can rot." Ethan leaned in. "How old?" Gus's mouth tightened. "Hard to say without more, but older than most of the town thinks it is." His eyes flicked to Ethan. "Where'd you find it?" Ethan chose his words carefully. "Near a closed area, ground instability. The dog found it." Gus looked at Ranger, who stood now, head slightly lowered, eyes fixed on the wood in Gus's hands. Gus's brows lifted. "He found it, huh? Of course he did." Ethan frowned. "You believe that means something." Gus didn't answer immediately. He walked to a shelf, pulled down a small jar, and dabbed a bit of liquid onto a rag. He wiped the wood gently. The scent rose sharper. Tar, old water, something faintly metallic. Gus's eyes softened, and when he spoke, his voice lost some of its humor. "My daddy used to tell a story," he said. "Not the kind you read in books, the kind people tell when they've got a fire going and the lake is making noises you can't explain." Ethan stayed silent. Ranger remained still, like a guard at a threshold. Gus continued. "He said there's a place in these woods where the ground breathes, comes alive in spring, settles in summer, and in the fall. It sighs, and when it sighs, it gives up things it swallowed. Just a little, like it's tasting the past." Ethan's skin tightened along his arms. "A legend?" Gus shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just what people call geology when they don't have the right words." He held the wood up again. "But this ain't a campfire lie." Ethan's mind flashed with the shape he'd seen, the curve too deliberate to be accident. Gus set the wood down gently. "This looks like it came off a passenger ship, the kind folks used in the old days, back when they hauled people and supplies across water because roads were suggestions." He tapped the scrollwork. "They decorated even their workhorses back then, put a bit of beauty on hardship." Ethan's throat tightened unexpectedly. Beauty on hardship? That sounded like something people did when they didn't think they'd survive without it. He asked, "So how does a ship piece end up in the woods?" Gus's smile returned, but it wasn't light. "That's the question that makes people act foolish." Ranger made a quiet sound in the back of his throat, not a bark, a restrained vibrating warning. Ethan watched the dog's ears angle toward the lake as if something out there had shifted. Gus noticed. "He always do that?" Ethan hesitated. "Only when something stirs him?" Gus nodded slowly, like he already understood. Gus reached under the workbench and pulled out a battered tin box. He opened it and removed a small brass disc, greened with age, an old token, maybe a coin. It had a faint anchor stamped on one side. "Found that down near the marsh 15 years ago," Gus said quietly. "Thought it was junk. Then I cleaned it." He placed it beside Ethan's carved wood. Ranger's reaction was immediate and unsettling. The dog stepped forward, nostrils flaring, and then, without any command, he backed away 2 full steps, hackles rising along his shoulders. His eyes widened, not with fear like a pet startled by thunder, but with recognition so intense it looked like pain. Ethan's pulse jumped. Ranger? The dog didn't break his stare from the brass disc. His breathing turned shallow, measured, as if he were trying not to inhale too much of the memory in the air. Gus's humor vanished completely. "That ain't normal," he murmured. Ethan's hand tightened on the leash. His mind raced through possibilities. Ranger had been exposed to explosives, weapons, blood, salt water, things most dogs never knew existed. What kind of object could shake him like this? Ethan crouched beside Ranger. The dog's body trembled once, a single controlled shiver. Then he steadied himself. He looked at Ethan for the first time in minutes, and something in that gaze, dark, intelligent, pleading, hit Ethan like a fist. Not go, not stop, but remember. Ethan swallowed hard. "Okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure what he was agreeing to. The moment passed, but it left a mark. Gus slowly closed the tin box as if sealing away a ghost. Ethan straightened. "Gus," he said, carefully, "that disc, where exactly did you find it?" Gus rubbed his beard. "Edge of the marsh, near the old cattails. Same general direction as the closed valley." He paused, then added, "I didn't tell the sheriff. Folks around here don't love strangers poking at old bones." Ethan felt a cold thread run through him. So there's more than one piece. Gus's eyes narrowed. "You saying you saw more?" Ethan didn't describe the bow. Not yet. He wasn't ready to put those words in a room where they could become rumor. Instead, he said, "I think there's something bigger." Gus held his gaze for a long moment. The old man's voice softened. "Son, sometimes bigger don't mean better. Sometimes bigger means it got more ways to hurt you." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I know." And that was the truth. He knew too well. Gus slid the carved wood back into the bag. "I'll do you a favor," he said. "I'll look through my daddy's old notebooks. He kept records, wood types, local finds, old maps people brought him. I can't promise anything, but if there's a ship story, he might have scribbled something." Ethan nodded. "I'd appreciate it." Gus's eyes flicked to Ranger again. The dog had settled, but his posture stayed tense, like a man trying to stand calmly after hearing bad news. Gus lowered his voice. "That dog of yours, he ain't just trained, he's carrying something." Ethan's throat tightened. "I think so, too." Gus leaned closer, and for the first time he looked less like a carpenter and more like an old priest giving reluctant counsel. "Animals don't forget the way we pretend to," he said. "If he's reacting to that brass, it means it's tied to something he lived through. And if it's tied to something he lived through—" He let the sentence hang, heavy as a wet coat. Ethan finished it silently. "It can happen again." On the drive back, the lake glittered brighter than before, mocking the heaviness in Ethan's chest. Ranger stared out the window, but his eyes were distant, focused on something not visible in the summer light. Ethan's mind kept circling one thought, Ranger's reaction to the brass disc. Not fear, not alarm, recognition. That evening, in the cabin, Ethan pulled Ranger's old service file from the bottom of his pack, paperwork he hadn't opened in months. He'd avoided it the way a man avoided touching a scar to see if it still hurt. Ranger lay at his feet, head on his paws, eyes half closed but not asleep. His ears twitched when Ethan turned pages. The file smelled faintly of dust and government ink. Ethan skimmed training logs, deployment notes, commendations. He stopped at a section labeled Handler History. A name stared up at him. Chief Petty Officer Daniel Dane Kerrigan. Ethan hadn't met him, but the details were enough. Arctic water training, Maritime Operations, a line item marked KIA, training accident. Ethan's breath caught. He looked down at Ranger. The dog didn't move, but his eyes opened fully, dark and steady. In them, Ethan saw something that made his chest ache. Not guilt like a human might carry, but a kind of unspoken vow, the way a dog promised without language. Ethan reached down and rested his hand on Ranger's shoulder. The muscles beneath the fur were tight, alive. "I didn't know," Ethan whispered. Ranger's eyes stayed on him as if to say, "Now you do." Outside, the pines swayed gently. The lake kept shining. The world remained bright and indifferent. Inside, Ethan understood something with sudden clarity. Ranger hadn't led him toward a mystery for entertainment. Ranger had led him toward the place where an old failure still waited, unfinished. Ethan closed the file with careful hands, and in the quiet that followed, he made himself a promise he didn't yet know how to keep. He would not be late again. The next morning came with a blue sky so clean it felt almost insulting. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of the trailhead parking lot, hands shoved into the pockets of his olive field jacket, watching the county truck roll in as if it were just another routine appointment. The lake beyond the trees glittered like a polished coin. The pines swayed gently. Everything in the world looked like it belonged to summer. Inside Ethan, nothing was seasonal. Everything was old. Ranger waited at his side, black and tan coat sleek in the sunlight, posture tight as a coiled spring. He wasn't pulling now. He'd learned the boundaries of conversation with humans, but he kept his gaze fixed in the same direction, toward the restricted valley. Every few seconds his ears twitched, and his nose lifted as if he could taste something on the air that Ethan could not. Ethan had slept only in fragments. Not nightmares exactly, worse than nightmares. The kind of half-dream where the mind replayed regret, like a training video you couldn't turn off. The county truck door opened. A man stepped out who looked like he belonged more in a laboratory than a forest. He was tall and narrow-shouldered, maybe mid-40s, with pale skin that hadn't spent much time under sun. His hair was dark and thinning at the crown, combed back with the careful precision of someone who liked order. Wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. He carried a hard plastic equipment case in one hand and a tablet in the other, moving with a brisk efficiency that suggested he hated being late. He wore hiking boots that still looked new, jeans and a dark windbreaker zipped up despite the mild weather. His expression held the mild irritation of a professional forced to do field work when he'd rather be reading numbers. "Dr. Calvin Rusk," he introduced himself, voice clipped but not unkind. "County Geotech." Ethan offered a nod. "Ethan Cole, Trail Safety." Rusk's gaze flicked to Ranger. "And this is?" "Ranger," Ethan said. "Retired K-9. Rusk gave a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm more of a spreadsheets person than a dogs person." Ranger stared back, unmoved by labels. He wasn't impressed by credentials. He cared about truth. A second vehicle arrived, Deputy Marla Vance's unmarked SUV. She stepped out with the same controlled economy as before, dark hair tucked neatly, expression composed like it had been ironed flat. She wore a simple jacket over plain clothes, badge visible at her belt. Her eyes swept the area and landed on Ethan. "You showed," she said. "I said I would," Ethan replied. Marla's attention shifted to Dr. Rusk. "You're the expert?" Rusk adjusted his glasses. "If we're using that word loosely..." Marla didn't smile. "We're using it because the ground doesn't care what we call you. It'll drop whoever steps wrong." Nora Hale arrived last, walking in with her ranger cap and her wiry, weather-ready posture. Her blonde braid was tucked back, freckles bright in the sun. She looked tired in the way people looked when their job was preventing other people's worst decisions. "All right," Nora said. "We stay on the safe line. We don't test fate. Dr. Rusk, you tell us what we need to know. Ethan, you log it. Deputy, You keep everyone honest. Marla's eyes flicked to Ethan. He'll try. Ethan didn't argue. She wasn't wrong. They moved toward the closure sign and stopped well before the soft edge. Dr. Rusk opened his equipment case like a surgeon preparing for an operation. He pulled out a metal probe, a compact measuring device, and a coil of bright flagging tape. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who trusted instruments more than instinct. As Rusk took readings, Ethan watched the ground. It looked normal in the way dangerous things often did. A patchwork of moss, damp leaves, and roots. The kind of terrain a casual hiker might step on, without a second thought. Rusk jabbed the probe into the soil and frowned at the resistance, or the lack of it. He stepped back, tapped something into his tablet, and did it again a few feet away. "Water saturated," he muttered. "Void pockets, likely a kettle depression feeding into peat layers. The load-bearing capacity here is unreliable." Nora exhaled through her nose. In English, Rusk glanced up, slightly offended. "The ground can swallow you?" Marla nodded once, as if that translation satisfied her. Rusk traced the boundary with his flagging tape, setting bright markers that looked absurdly cheerful against the dark earth. "This area shifts. It's not stable enough for foot traffic. If something heavy's sitting in there, rocks, fallen trees, debris, those shifts can expose or bury it seasonally." Ethan kept his face neutral, but inside a quiet click happened, a mechanism of understanding sliding into place. Expose or bury. That wasn't just geology. That was a metaphor with teeth. Ranger's nails scraped softly against the dirt. The dog didn't whine. He didn't bark. He simply shifted, restless, as if time itself were an itch under his skin. Ethan placed a steadying hand on Ranger's shoulder. The muscle beneath the fur was tight, controlled, contained. Marla watched Ethan's hand and then looked at his face. "You're somewhere else," she said. Ethan forced himself back into the present. "I'm here." Marla's expression remained flat, but her voice softened by a fraction. "I've seen that look. Men who survive certain kinds of work, they live in two timelines." Ethan didn't answer. He didn't trust what would come out if he did. Nora studied Rusk's flags and the orange sign. "So we keep it closed." Rusk nodded. "Closed, fenced, monitored, preferably with periodic surveying, and no one steps into the depression. The peat can liquefy under stress." Marla folded her arms. "Which is why I'm here. People don't listen to science. They listen to consequences." Ethan's gaze drifted toward the trees, toward the unseen valley beyond the flags. He could feel it like a low hum in his bones, something there, waiting, patient. Marla followed his gaze and her jaw tightened. "You're thinking about the last time," she said. Nora looked sharply at Marla. "Deputy—" Marla cut her off with a small shake of her head. "He's already involved, and he's going to do something stupid if he doesn't understand what's at stake." Ethan's throat tightened. "I'm not planning anything." Marla's eyes held him steady. "Then let's talk about it like adults. A man went in there years back, not yesterday, not last week. Years? He thought he knew the woods, thought he could outsmart a warning sign." She didn't describe the search, not in detail. She didn't need to. Her voice carried enough weight to fill in the blanks. Mud, ropes, shouting, the slow, terrible realization that sometimes the earth didn't give back what it took. Ethan listened, jaw clenched. He had heard plenty of death stories in his life. What hit him wasn't the story itself. It was the structure of it, the pattern. A person goes in. A moment passes where rescue is possible. Then that moment closes, and everyone left behind has to live with the timestamp of when it shut. Ethan's fingers curled inside his jacket pocket until his nails pressed his skin. He didn't feel it. Pain was a language he spoke fluently. Dr. Rusk cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the emotional temperature. From a technical standpoint, he said, the probability of successful retrieval decreases exponentially after initial entrapment in saturated peat. If someone falls in— "Stop," Nora snapped. Not angry at him exactly, angry at the coldness of math describing human loss. Rusk blinked, then nodded stiffly and returned to his tablet. Ranger took one step forward, then stopped, as if he'd hit an invisible wall. His ears angled forward, his eyes narrowed. Ethan felt the dog's impatience not as misbehavior, but as urgency. Rusk's tablet chimed, a bland digital sound. He frowned at the screen. He murmured. Marla's eyes sharpened. What? Rusk hesitated, then tilted the tablet so they could see. It was a map overlay, county land records, and old survey lines. He tapped once, zooming in. "This depression," he said, "sits near an outdated boundary marker. It's odd. The original survey notes, 19th century, label the area with a handwritten remark." He squinted, reading. "Unsafe ground, avoid," and "Old hull sighted after thaw." The words sat there like a quiet accusation. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs in a slow, controlled exhale. Nora's freckles looked suddenly pale. Marla didn't blink. "Old hull," she repeated, voice low. Rusk nodded, uncomfortable now. It could mean anything. A logjam, a collapsed structure. The old surveyors wrote dramatic notes sometimes. Ranger, who had been restless, went perfectly still at the sound of those words. He lifted his head and stared toward the trees with a focus so absolute it was almost reverent. Ethan didn't move. He didn't speak, because suddenly this wasn't just a strange discovery. This was a thing recorded, warned about, left alone, a truth the town had stepped around for more than a century. Marla watched Ethan's face. "You hear that?" she asked softly. "This isn't new." Ethan swallowed, throat tight. "No," he managed. "It's not." The moment passed, but it changed the shape of the day. The valley wasn't just dangerous terrain. It was history. And history had been waiting. They finished the assessment with more flags, more measurements, more official language. Nora took notes. Marla made calls. Rusk packed his equipment with quick, irritated motions, like he wanted, distance from whatever story was forming. Ethan logged everything, but his mind kept drifting, because the word hull had hooked into him like a barb. He remembered a different kind of waiting, heat instead of cold, sand instead of peat, radio chatter instead of birdsong. A mission years ago overseas where his team had paused for the safe window, where Ethan had done what training demanded, protect the unit, confirm the threat, wait for the right moment. Waiting was supposed to be wisdom. But wisdom didn't stop a bullet. Wisdom didn't stop a man from bleeding out while the clock was still polite enough to tick. He didn't see the scene in full. He never did. His brain protected him by showing only fragments. A hand reaching, a voice calling his name, the metallic taste of adrenaline, and the sickening certainty that later was going to arrive, wearing the mask of too late. Ethan blinked hard and forced himself to breathe. Marla's voice cut through his thoughts. "Cole." He looked at her. Her eyes were steady, but there was something human in them now, something that wasn't badge deep. "Whatever you did back then," she said quietly, "don't try to fix it here by dying in a bog." Ethan's mouth twitched, humor dry and bitter. "Not my plan." Marla's gaze slid to Ranger. "Your dog seems to think time matters." Ethan looked down. Ranger's ears were up. His body leaned subtly toward the trees, even while he obeyed the leash. He wasn't frantic. He was intent, like a man staring at a closing door. Ethan's chest tightened. He understood that feeling too well. Nora approached, rolling up the last of the tape. "We'll keep it locked down," she said, "and we'll post more signs, maybe even a fence." Ethan nodded, but his eyes stayed on the woods. because somewhere beyond those trees was a shape that shouldn't exist, and now there was proof that it had been seen before. Marla stepped closer, voice low enough that only Ethan could hear. "You don't want to be the man who arrives too late again?" she said. It wasn't a question. It was an understanding. Ethan didn't answer out loud. He didn't need to. Ranger shifted beside him, restless again, as if the dog's patience was burning down to a thin line. Ethan placed a hand on Ranger's shoulder, and he realized, quietly, painfully, that whatever waited in that valley didn't care about flags or signs or county records. Time didn't ask permission. Time only moved, and Ranger somehow could feel it. Could. The storm didn't arrive like a shout. It arrived like a decision. Quiet at first, then absolute. By mid-afternoon, the sky over the lake had turned the color of steel. The sunlight that usually made the water glitter went dull, as if someone had thrown a gray blanket over the world. Wind pushed through the pines in uneasy waves, bending the branches and making the needles whisper warnings against each other. Ethan Cole stood on the porch of his small rental cabin, one hand on the doorframe, watching the tree line darken. His olive field jacket was zipped up, collar turned against the chill. The old military watch on his wrist ticked with stubborn calm. Ranger sat at his boots, black and tan coat bristling slightly as the wind carried scents that didn't belong. Rain, wet earth, and something deeper, older, like a mouth opening in the ground. Ethan had learned to respect weather the way he respected silence. Both could kill you without raising their voice. His radio crackled. "Trail ops to all units. We've got a check-in failure. 2 hikers overdue. Last known location, North Section Loop, near the closure boundary." Ethan's jaw tightened. Near the closure boundary meant near the valley. Near the valley meant the ground that could swallow a person without leaving a scream behind. He keyed the mic. "Cole copies. Any names?" A pause as someone shuffled papers. "Margaret and Tom Larkin, older couple. Volunteer group saw them earlier near the junction." Ethan's stomach sank, not because of fear, but because he remembered them. A day ago at the trail junction, he'd seen a couple who looked like they belonged in a warmer story. The woman, Margaret Larkin, was in her late 60s, short and sturdy, with silver hair pulled back under a bright knit cap that didn't match the forest at all. Her face carried the soft lines of someone who smiled easily, even when her knees complained. The man beside her, Tom Larkin, was taller, lean, but not. Fragile, with a sun-browned face and a white mustache that made him look perpetually amused. He'd carried a walking stick like it was a prop in a joke he hadn't delivered yet. They'd waved at Ethan. Margaret had laughed and said something about the weather being moody. Tom had added, "We'll be back before it decides to be dramatic." Ethan had smiled in his dry way. Now the weather was dramatic. And they weren't back. Nora Hale's voice cut in next, sharp with urgency. "Deputy Vance is mobilizing. Ethan, do not go into the depression. Stay on the safe line. We're sending a team." Ethan looked down at Ranger. The dog had already risen, posture locked, ears forward, eyes dark and focused. Ranger wasn't frantic. He was ready. The kind of ready that didn't wait for permission. Ethan's throat tightened. "Trail ops," he said into the radio, voice steady. "I'm closest. I'm moving to the junction to establish last known point. I will remain outside. The restricted boundary." He clipped the mic off, but the words felt like a lie he couldn't guarantee. Rain began as a soft tapping on the porch roof, then thickened into a hard, cold curtain. The lake disappeared behind sheets of water. Trees blurred into shadows. Ethan grabbed his Eberle-stock half-track pack, checked his pocket knife, and tightened his boots. Not because he wanted to play hero, because he knew what happened when you lost minutes to indecision. Ranger waited at the door, a silent question. Ethan opened it. "All right," he murmured. "We go." They reached the trail junction in less than 15 minutes, the wind shoving them sideways the whole way. Mud formed instantly underfoot. Water ran in thin rivers along the path. At the junction, Nora was there already, drenched, radio in hand, blonde braids slick against her jacket. Her freckles stood out sharply on her pale skin, and her eyes flashed with the kind of anger that came from caring too much. Marla's SUV slid into the gravel behind them. Deputy Marla Vance stepped out, rain streaking down her dark hair, face set like stone. She carried a flashlight even though it wasn't dark yet, because storms made their own night. "Larkins," Marla said to Nora. "Any signal?" Nora shook her head. "No phone ping, no response to calls." Marla looked at Ethan. "You?" "I remember them," Ethan said. "They were heading North Loop. They joked about beating the weather." Marla's mouth tightened. "Weather's winning." She raised her radio. "Search team is en route. 10 minutes." Ethan scanned the trail. Water poured off the pines. The closure sign ahead looked smaller in the rain, less like authority and more like a plea. Ranger pulled gently, then stopped and lowered his head, sniffing the wet ground. His tail was low and steady. His ears angled, listening through the roar of rain for something human. Ethan felt the old instinct in his bones. Triage, pattern, recognition, the cold math of survival. "Deputy," he said, voice tight. "If they wandered near the closure boundary, the storm could have pushed them off the path." Marla's eyes narrowed. "You're thinking about the valley." "I'm thinking about time," Ethan answered. Nora stepped closer, rain dripping off her hat brim. "Ethan, don't." He looked at her. "If they slipped, minutes matter." Nora's voice cracked with anger. "And if you slip, then we're searching for 3. Marla held Ethan's gaze. "Cole," she said, low, "you stay on the safe line." Ethan nodded. He meant it. Then Ranger did something that made the decision for him. The dog stopped sniffing and lifted his head sharply, nostrils flaring. His body angled toward the trees, not the trail, but the brush line where water ran in fast streams. Ranger stepped forward, then paused, looking back at Ethan once, eyes intense, commanding without language. Ethan's chest tightened. Ranger wasn't asking. He was telling. Ethan clicked his radio on. "I'm moving along the safe perimeter line to locate any off-trail sign. I am not entering the depression." Marla's reply came immediate. "Cole." But Ethan was already moving, Ranger leading him along the edge where the ground still felt firm. He kept one eye on the flagged markers Dr. Rusk had set. He stayed outside them. He did everything right. And still the valley felt like it was pulling. They found the first clue 5 minutes later, a strip of bright knit fabric snagged on a thorn bush, a piece of Margaret's cheerful cap. It fluttered in the rain like a small, desperate flag. Ethan's stomach dropped. He crouched, touched it. Warmth had long left it. Ranger sniffed it once, then moved on, nose to the air now rather than the ground, tracking scent despite the rain, which tried to erase everything. Thunder rolled overhead, not loud at first, then suddenly close enough to make Ethan feel it in his teeth. A gust of wind tore through the trees, and somewhere deeper, something cracked. A heavy sound, like wood breaking under too much history. Ethan froze. Ranger's head snapped toward the valley. Another crack, louder, then a groan, long, low, like a giant animal shifting in pain. Ethan's breath caught. A pine, one of the tallest, tilted in the wind. Its roots, loosened by saturated soil, lifted like fingers. The tree fell not straight down but sideways, dragged by the slope, sliding toward the depression. Ethan didn't see the ship. He heard it. A deep, hollow impact, wood on wood, followed by a splintering collapse that echoed through the rain. Ranger lunged forward. Ethan grabbed the leash. "No!" But Ranger wasn't charging blindly. The dog darted along the edge and then stopped abruptly, paws skidding in mud as if he'd found the exact line between rescue and suicide. Ethan's boot slipped. The ground beneath his right foot softened, gave way by inches. His heart slammed. He had time to think one clear thought. This is how it happens. Then the earth shifted again, and Ethan's foot sank deeper, mud sucking at his boot like a hand. Ranger whipped around and clamped his jaws onto Ethan's jacket sleeve, not tearing, not panicking, gripping with trained precision. He leaned back, muscles straining, pulling Ethan away from the soft edge. Ethan threw his weight backward, digging his left boot into firmer ground. Mud tried to steal his right boot completely. He fought the suction, breath harsh, rain cold against his face. Ranger pulled once, twice, steady as a winch. Ethan's boot ripped free with a wet, violent pop. He stumbled backward and hit the ground hard, wind knocked out of him. Ranger stood over him, panting, eyes wide but controlled. Ethan sucked in air. "Good boy," he rasped. "Good?" Ranger's ears twitched. A sound, faint, almost swallowed by rain, threaded through the storm. A voice, not close, but there. Ethan pushed himself up, heart hammering. He lifted his head. "Hello?" Nothing. Again, faint, a cough, a weak call. Ranger spun, nose high, and moved along the edge, weaving between trees with purpose. Ranger stopped at a fallen log and began pawing at the mud, not digging wildly, but scraping in short, urgent strokes. His breath came fast, and his eyes flicked to Ethan, then back to the ground, as if begging Ethan to understand the invisible map he was reading. Ethan stepped closer and saw it. The mud here was different. Churned, disturbed, like someone had slid down and tried to claw their way back up. Then he saw a handprint, not fresh, not crisp, but unmistakably human. Ethan's throat tightened. He crouched and pressed his gloved hand near it. The mud was cold. The print was shallow, smeared by rain. Someone had been here. Someone had tried to climb. Ranger let out a strained, broken whine, the kind of sound that didn't belong to a disciplined K-9. It sounded like grief, trying to speak. Ethan felt something inside him crack open, an old memory of reaching, of not reaching far enough, of a voice calling, then stopping. He looked at Ranger, and for a heartbeat he saw not a dog, but a partner who had once failed to pull someone from cold water and had carried the weight ever since. Ethan's voice came out rough. "We're not leaving," he whispered. And Ranger, trembling once, steadied, like he'd been waiting years to hear those words. Ethan keyed his radio with shaking fingers. "Deputy Vance, I have evidence of a slide near the perimeter. Possible victim contact. I hear faint voice responses. Location, east edge of closure boundary, 50 yards north of the sign." Marla's voice snapped back through static. "Cole, do not—" "I'm staying on safe ground," Ethan cut in. "But they're close. We need rope now." Nora's voice broke in, urgent. "We're coming. Stay put." Ethan stayed where the ground felt firm, but he moved along the edge with Ranger, calling out, listening. The storm fought him. Wind shoved his words back down his throat. Rain blurred everything into gray. "Margaret!" he shouted. "Tom, if you can hear me, answer!" A weak sound came back, so faint Ethan wasn't sure it was real. Ranger's ears locked, and he trotted forward 2 steps, then stopped again at the boundary like it burned. Ethan could see nothing but swaying branches and a slick slope. Then, through the rain, he saw a shape, an arm maybe, or a hiking stick wedged between roots. Ranger whined again and stepped forward. Too far. The ground under Ranger's paws gave slightly, and the dog slipped, claws scraping. Ranger caught himself, but the mud grabbed his hind leg. "Ranger!" Ethan lunged and grabbed the harness strap at the dog's shoulders, hauling him back with all his strength. Ranger's leg came free, but not cleanly. He yelped once, sharp and involuntary. When he landed on firmer ground, he held the leg slightly off the earth. Ethan's chest clenched. "No, no, buddy." Ranger tried to step forward anyway, stubborn as a soldier. Ethan saw it then. The choice, clean and cruel. He could pull back, wait for the team, keep himself alive. Or he could act now, with the risk that the valley would take more than a boot. He thought of Marla's story, of the man who wasn't rescued in time. He thought of the mission years ago, the safe delay, the right call, the wrong result. He looked at Ranger's dark eyes, shining with pain and determination, and Ethan understood with sudden calm. If he turned away now, he would survive. But he would become the man who arrived too late again. Ethan tightened his grip on Ranger's harness and raised his radio. "Deputy," he said, voice steady despite the storm. "I'm not stepping into the depression, but I'm not leaving this perimeter, not until I know where they are." Thunder rolled like a verdict. Ranger, limping, leaned into Ethan's leg, and in the middle of the rain and the roaring trees, Ethan made the decision he'd been running from for years. This time, he would not turn away. The storm left the world rinsed raw. Morning came pale and washed out, the lake wearing a thin veil of fog as if it didn't want to look too closely at what had happened in the night. The pines still swayed, but the wind had lost its teeth. Water dripped steadily from needles and branches, tapping the earth like a patient metronome. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of the restricted boundary, with mud dried in dark streaks on his boots and pant legs. His olive field jacket clung damply at the shoulders. The red and deep green plaid beneath looked darker, as if the storm had bled color from everything. His face was rough with stubble, jaw tight, blue-gray eyes hollowed by a night that had been equal parts action and helpless waiting. Ranger leaned against Ethan's leg, weight shifted to protect the injured hind limb. The German shepherd's black and tan coat was spattered with mud. His eyes were still sharp, still working. But there was a guardedness now, a slight hesitation when he tested the ground. The dog's loyalty hadn't cracked. His body simply carried a new rule. Pain exists, and it will return when cold does. Deputy Marla Vance arrived first, tire tracks cutting fresh lines through wet gravel. She stepped out with rain-dark hair tucked behind her ears, face composed like she'd filed away last night's panic into a drawer marked later. She wore plain clothes again, badge visible, and in her hand was a clipboard already dotted with moisture. Behind her came Nora Hale in a Ranger truck, freckles bright against pale skin, blonde braid damp and heavy. She moved briskly, radio clipped at her chest, eyes scanning the woods like she was counting risks. And then, one by one, the rest came. Local fire and rescue, 2 county workers with caution cones, a volunteer with a medical bag, a small procession of people drawn by necessity, not curiosity. Among them was a man Ethan hadn't seen before, broad and sturdy, in a yellow slicker, with a beard the color of rust and a face carved by windburn and long winters. His name patch read, Hank Doran. Hank's eyes were kind, but his voice held the blunt calm of someone who'd pulled too many bodies from too many bad places. "You're Cole," he said, extending a gloved hand. "I'm Hank, rescue coordinator. Nora says you kept your head last night." Ethan shook his hand. "I tried." Hank's gaze dropped to Ranger. "And that one?" he asked quietly. "Ranger," Ethan said. "He kept me alive." Hank nodded once, respectful in the way professionals respected each other. "Good dog." Ranger's ears flicked at the tone, praise without hype, and he blinked slowly, accepting it like a soldier accepting a medal he didn't think he deserved. Marla gathered them by the closure sign. "We're not here to play explorer," she said. "We're here to verify hazards, document the collapse, and confirm the Larkins are accounted for." Nora's shoulders eased a fraction at the mention of the couple. They'd been found late last night on safer ground, cold, shaken, but alive, pulled back before the valley could take them. Relief sat in the group like a fragile glass you didn't want to knock over. Ethan didn't let himself dwell on it. Relief was good. Relief wasn't the end. Hank laid out equipment, ropes, harnesses, a long pole, a compact drone case. He spoke with crisp authority, assigning positions, setting rules. No one crossed the flag line. No one stepped onto soft ground. Everything was anchored. Ethan stayed quiet, observing the old SEAL instincts humming under his skin. He could tell Hank had done this before. The man's movements were measured, conservative, every action designed to avoid creating the second emergency that became the first. They approached the depression from the safest angle, where Dr. Rusk's flag still fluttered like little surrender banners. The storm had shifted the terrain. The slope looked torn open in places, exposed roots dangling like ribs. And then, through the thinning fog, the structure revealed itself more clearly than before. Not just a curve of wood, a wreck. Dark timbers hunched in the valley like the spine of a fallen beast. Sections had collapsed inward where the pine had struck. Rusted iron straps clung to the wood in broken arcs. The smell rising from it wasn't fresh. It was ancient, thick with pitch and water, and long-held silence. Marla stood very still. "So it's real," she said, voice barely above a breath. Nora's mouth tightened. "I didn't want it to be." Hank stared down into the valley with a professional's cold eye. "Real or not, it's unsafe. We document from here." Ethan's gaze locked on the wreckage. He felt it again, that strange sense that the world had been waiting for him to show up and witness something it didn't have language for. Ranger, despite his injury, stepped forward until Ethan's hand on the harness stopped him. The dog's eyes were fixed on the timbers, not with curiosity, but with something close to mourning. Marla looked at Ethan. "You brought a piece to Gus," she said. Ethan nodded. "He said it was shipwork, passenger ship, old." Nora frowned. "Passenger ship? Here?" Hank's brow furrowed. "Could have come from the lake," he offered. "Old wreck got moved by ice or flood." Ethan didn't argue, but he didn't believe it was that simple. The valley didn't feel like a place that merely collected debris. It felt like a place that kept it. They began documenting. Photos, measurements, drone footage from above. The drone's small whine cut through the hush, and Ethan watched its camera tilt, capturing angles the human eye couldn't safely reach. Then Hank said, "We need one person on tether for a closer look at the collapsed section. Not into the soft center, just to the firmer shelf. I'll do it." Marla's jaw clenched. Hank held up a gloved hand. "I won't be a hero. I'll be a clipboard with legs." His humor was dry but kind, and it loosened the tension just enough for people to breathe. Ethan watched as Hank clipped into a harness and anchored to 2 points. A second rescuer, a young woman with dark skin and tight curls tucked under a helmet, Keisha Rowe, paramedic, checked the knots with careful, practiced fingers. Keisha was in her late 20s, athletic and compact, eyes sharp with competence. She spoke softly but firmly, the way medical professionals spoke when they were used to fear and refused to feed it. "Weight stays back," she told Hank. "If it shifts, you freeze. If you feel pull, you call it." Hank nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Ethan couldn't help a faint smile. Even in disasters, the world found room for small jokes. Hank moved down the firmer shelf with slow steps, boots testing each patch. Mud sucked at the edges, but he stayed to the more solid ridge. The drone hovered above like a patient hawk. Ethan held Ranger steady. The dog's body trembled slightly, not panic, but strain, like he wanted to leap forward and couldn't. Hank reached the collapsed section of the wreck. He didn't touch the structure at first. He leaned in and inspected it the way Gus had inspected the carved wood, with respect for what time did to old things. Then he lifted his flashlight and shone it into a dark opening where the hull had split. "Holy," Hank whispered. Marla's voice snapped. "What?" Hank's throat worked. "There's stuff in there, not modern, not trash." Ethan's heartbeat quickened. Hank reached in carefully with the long pole and nudged something closer to the light. A scrap of fabric drifted into view, stiffened and darkened by age. Beside it, a rusted metal fitting. And then, something round and small that caught the light with a dull, stubborn glow. Hank's pole nudged it again. A tiny bell rolled slightly, half buried in debris. It wasn't large. It wasn't ornate, but it carried the weight of 1,000 untold moments. Ethan's breath caught. Ranger made a sound, soft, involuntary, like a sigh that had been held too long. Hank reached carefully and lifted the bell with gloved fingers. Mud clung to it. A thin chain was wrapped around its base, fused by time. He held it up. Even from the ridge, Ethan could see faint engraving on the side, letters worn almost smooth. Marla's eyes narrowed. "That looks like a ship's bell." Nora swallowed. Why would a bell be in a forest? Ethan didn't answer because he couldn't. His mind filled in images he didn't want to see. People waiting, listening, hoping the sound of that bell meant rescue had come. A signal, a promise, and the promise never fulfilled. As Hank adjusted his grip, the bell slipped slightly in his glove. It rang, not loudly, nothing dramatic, just a single, thin chime, muted by mud and distance. But the sound was unmistakable. Ethan's entire body went still, as if someone had pressed pause on him. Ranger's reaction was even stranger. The dog lowered himself to the ground, not collapsing, but easing down with solemn precision. His ears flattened, and his eyes fixed on the bell with a focus so intense it looked like devotion. Then he did something Ethan had never seen him do in all their time together. Ranger let out one low, controlled whine, then fell silent, as if the sound had been stolen from him. Ethan's chest tightened painfully. He wasn't watching a dog react to noise. He was watching a partner react to memory. Marla's face softened by a fraction, the first crack in her armor. Nora's hand rose to her mouth, fingertips pressing against her lips, like she was keeping in a sob. Keisha murmured, almost to herself, "That's not normal?" Hank froze, gripping the bell as if it might shatter. "Sorry," he said quietly. "Didn't mean to." Ethan shook his head once, barely able to speak. "It's okay?" But it wasn't okay, because that small sound had turned the wreck from a curiosity into a witness, and witnesses didn't just exist. They testified. Hank carefully placed the bell into an evidence bag and clipped it to his harness. He backed away from the wreck with slow steps, guided by Keisha's voice, until he reached firm ground again. Marla took the bag and held it like it weighed more than metal. "We document, we log, we secure," she said, but her voice wasn't just procedure anymore. It carried something else. Responsibility. Nora stared at the wreck, her hazel eyes shining with anger and sorrow. "All this time," she whispered, "all these years." Ethan watched Ranger. The dog was upright again, but his injured leg trembled when he shifted. He tried to hide it, the way proud creatures tried to hide pain. Ethan knelt and ran a hand along Ranger's shoulder. "You're okay," he whispered. "You're here." Ranger's eyes met his, dark, steady, stubborn. Ethan realized then that Ranger's injury wasn't the deepest wound. The deepest wound was the one that kept pulling him back toward places where he'd failed to pull someone out. Marla spoke again, voice low and firm. "Gus said passenger ship. We get him here. We get the Historical Society. We cross-check records. We find out if anyone knew about this and kept quiet." Hank nodded. "And we keep this area locked down. This isn't just a hazard. It's evidence." Nora's gaze sharpened. "Evidence of what?" Marla's eyes held the wreck. "Of a story someone didn't want finished." Ethan swallowed. The storm had passed, but inside him another weather system was forming, one made of guilt and purpose and the dangerous desire to make right what couldn't be undone. Ranger shifted beside him and winced, the small betrayal of pain. Ethan's jaw clenched. He thought of his own past, of choosing the safe window, the correct procedure, the delay that turned into a funeral. He looked down into the valley where the broken hull hunched like a quiet monument. And he understood something that made his throat burn. Sometimes the world didn't need heroes. Sometimes it needed someone to show up on time and stay long enough to listen. The bell sat in Marla's hands, silent now, but Ethan could still feel its single chime inside his bones. The season changed the way seasons always did, without asking permission. Summer thinned into fall, and fall leaned quietly into the long northern cold. The lake darkened from blue to slate, then to iron. Frost crept into the mornings and stayed longer each day, like a guest who had decided to move in. The pines held their green, but the undergrowth faded, the ground stiffening as if the earth itself were drawing a breath and bracing. By the time winter arrived in earnest, the valley no longer looked like a place where something had happened. It looked like a place that had finished. Ethan Cole stood with his hands tucked into the pockets of his olive field jacket, watching snow drift down in slow, deliberate flakes. He had come alone this time, not to cross lines or challenge warnings, but to witness what the land was doing on its own. Below him, where the broken hull had once hunched and groaned after the storm, the ground had sunk further. The peat had collapsed inward, reshaping the valley into a shallow bowl filled with ice-dark water and reeds already bent by frost. The flags and tape were gone, replaced by a permanent fence set back at a respectful distance. There was no wood visible now, no iron, no suggestion of ribs or curves or human intention. The forest had closed over the wound, not magically, not suddenly, patiently. Ethan felt a strange calm as he took it in. He had learned over the years that closure rarely came with ceremony. It arrived quietly, like this, through weather, time, and the refusal of the world to hold on to what it no longer needed. Ranger sat beside him, older now in the subtle ways that mattered. His black and tan coat had gone slightly lighter around the muzzle. The muscles were still there, but the easy spring in his step had softened. His injured leg bothered him when the cold sharpened. He favored it just enough that only someone who loved him would notice. But his eyes were the same. Deep, observant, steady. Ranger. Shifted and settled more carefully on the packed snow, breath fogging the air. He lifted his head once toward the valley, ears angled, not tense, not alert, just listening. Ethan exhaled slowly. "You were right," he murmured. "It wasn't meant to stay." He hadn't planned to stay in town. At first he told himself it was temporary, just long enough to help Nora update trail maps, long enough to assist Marla with documentation, long enough to give Gus time to dig through old records and notebooks that smelled like dust and pine resin. But temporary had a way of becoming habit. Nora Hale noticed first. She mentioned it one morning over coffee at the ranger station, her blonde braid tucked into a knit cap, freckles faint against winter-pale skin. "You know," she said casually, eyes on a stack of paperwork, "most folks don't stick around once the excitement dies down." Ethan shrugged. "Guess I missed the memo." She glanced up at him, hazel eyes thoughtful. "You're good with the trails. You're careful. And people listen to you, probably because you don't talk much." He gave a faint, dry smile. "It's a skill." Nora leaned back in her chair. "We could use someone like that, full-time." The offer landed without drama. Ethan didn't answer right away. He thought about the years he'd spent moving from one assignment to another, one continent to the next. He thought about how often he'd packed light because he didn't believe in staying. Then he thought about Ranger, stretched out by the cabin stove at night, content in a way that had nothing to do with orders. "I'll think about it," Ethan said. He didn't need much time. Deputy Marla Vance signed off on the last report a week later. The file was thick with photos, measurements, and careful language. She didn't embellish. She didn't speculate. She simply documented what could be proven and acknowledged what could not. When she handed Ethan a copy, her expression was softer than he'd ever seen it. "Stories don't always get endings," she said. Sometimes they just get put where they can't hurt anyone anymore? Ethan nodded. Sometimes that's enough. Marla hesitated, then added, You did good work. From her, it meant more than praise. Gus Merriweather came by the cabin one afternoon, boots crunching on snow, beard rimed with frost. He carried a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Found something, Gus said, setting it on the table with care. His eyes were bright but serious. Old shipping ledger, names, partial dates, nothing that'll make headlines. Ethan unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a thin notebook, brittle with age, pages filled with looping script, names, places, margins marked with question marks, and short prayers. People, Gus said quietly. Not cargo. Folks moving north, looking for land. Safer routes. Better odds. Ethan closed the notebook gently. They chose wrong. Gus shook his head. They chose the best they could with what they knew. That distinction stayed with Ethan. When the snow deepened and the days shortened, Ethan made his decision official. He took the job Nora offered. The ranger station gave him a small cabin near the trailhead, pine walls, a wood stove, a porch that faced the lake. It wasn't much. It was enough. He hung the ship's bell just outside the cabin door, mounted carefully beneath the eave where it would be sheltered from the worst of the weather. The chain was cleaned but not polished. The bell itself was left imperfect, its age visible, its scars intact. He didn't ring it on purpose. He didn't need to. The wind did that on its own. On quiet evenings, when the lake froze hard and the sky went pale with stars, a breeze would move through the trees, and the bell would answer with a soft, almost shy sound, no more than a whisper of metal. Not a call. A reminder. Ranger lay on the porch most nights wrapped in an old blanket, his body pressed against the boards as if grounding himself to something solid. When the bell stirred, he would lift his head, not sharply, not in alarm, but with recognition. His ears would angle. His gaze would settle somewhere distant. He didn't wag. He didn't whine. He listened. Ethan watched him from the doorway more than once, a mug warming his hands, and felt something loosen in his chest. One late afternoon, as winter leaned toward its deepest cold, Ethan took Ranger down to the lake's edge. The ice had formed thick and clear, the surface etched with pale cracks that looked like veins. Ranger moved slowly, careful with his bad leg, but his posture was calm. He stopped at the shoreline and lowered his head, sniffing the air. Then he did something unexpected. He sat, not facing the water, but facing back toward the woods. Ethan followed his gaze and felt a quiet shiver. For just a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. No wind, no birds, nothing moving. Then the silence passed. Ranger stood again, unhurried, and turned away, as if a conversation had ended. Ethan didn't know what the dog had sensed. He only knew that whatever it was, it had been acknowledged. And that was enough. Life settled into rhythm. Ethan cleared trails after storms, posted warnings before hikers could make mistakes, and walked the boundaries with Ranger at his side. People came to recognize them, the quiet man with the steady eyes, and the old K9 who moved like a shadow. Sometimes visitors asked about the bell. "What's that for?" they'd say, smiling. Ethan would answer simply, "To remember." He didn't explain further. On the coldest mornings, when the lake groaned beneath its ice and Ranger's steps slowed, Ethan adjusted their pace. He learned patience, the kind that wasn't waiting for a better moment, but choosing to be present in the one you had. He learned that showing up didn't always mean charging forward. Sometimes it meant staying. One evening, as snow began to fall again, Ethan sat on the cabin steps and listened to the forest breathe. Ranger lay beside him, head on his paws, eyes half closed. The bell stirred once in the wind. Ranger lifted his head. Ethan felt no fear, no urgency, just a quiet understanding. There were instincts that led you to places, dangerous places, necessary places. And then there were instincts that led you back to who you were meant to be when the noise fell away. Ethan rested his hand on Ranger's shoulder, feeling the warmth there, the steady pulse of life. "Good work," he murmured, not as a command, not as praise, but as gratitude. The forest stood around them, closed and whole, keeping what it needed to keep. And in that stillness, Ethan Cole finally understood. Some instincts don't guide you to a destination. They guide you home. Sometimes God does not send thunder or visions. Sometimes He sends a quiet sign in an ordinary day. A sudden pause on a trail, a warning in the wind, a loyal dog who refuses to move because his heart knows what our eyes cannot yet see. And in that small moment, grace shows up not as a spectacle, but as direction, not as a magic trick, but as mercy. This story is a reminder that miracles are often stitched into everyday life. They look like a second chance to do the right thing, like showing up for someone before it is too late, like listening to that gentle tug in your spirit that says, "Stop, turn back, help, stay." Sometimes God's protection is not the absence of danger, but the presence of guidance through it. If you are watching this and carrying your own regrets, hear this with hope. The past may shape you, but it does not have to define you. God can redeem what was broken and turn pain into purpose, one faithful step at a time. Even when you feel unseen, you are not forgotten. Even when the road feels quiet, heaven can still be speaking. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment and tell us what you believe Ranger's instinct was trying to say, or share a moment in your life when you felt God guiding you through something you could not explain. And if you want more true-to-heart K9 and Navy SEAL stories like this one, subscribe to the channel and stay with us on the trail. May God bless you and your family, keep you safe, and give you peace in your everyday life. May He guide your steps, strengthen your heart, and place the right people and the right protection in your path just when you need it most.